I'm Morgan Peckma, Editor-in-Chief of City and State, and this is Last Look. Today we're on location at the Downtown Conference Center of Pace University with State Senator George Latimer. Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Morgan, it's my pleasure.
You are the ranking minority member of the Education Committee, and you've made the Common Core a great focus of yours. What are the principal issues in your estimation surrounding the adaptation of the program?
Well, Morgan, given the fact that I represent a suburban district that includes some urban pockets, city of Yonkers, which I represent half of, which is the fourth largest city in the state, and some other areas, there's a great degree of discomfiture with what is being presented as educational reform. Now, Common Core is part of that. Race to the Top is part of that, but there are elements of it that have gotten a lot of grassroots blowback, and it's serious blowback. Now, there have been some public hearings where Commissioner King and maybe members of the Board of Regents have gone to public hearings, but at my level of government, I go into PTA meetings in individual districts and talk to school board members and school superintendents. Certainly in a number of the suburban districts, and particularly those that they're wealthy districts, they're successful districts, they have a high rate of students that graduate and go on to 2- and 4-year institutions. They score very well on standardized tests. There's a sense that this constant testing component that's going into this educational reform package is unnecessary in those situations. The thinking being that you test in order to identify a deficiency, not test for the sake of ongoing statistics. And what we're talking about under Common Core is testing 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. Too much testing, not necessary for the act of trying to get students to grasp the language skills and the math skills that they need to have. There's also a discomfiture over the data collection, and the sense that the data collection isn't essential to determine whether a student is performing well or not. And for those of us, now my daughter graduated public schools in my home community in Westchester 10 years ago, and she went on to a 4-year degree, graduate degree in social work. She has a job functioning. I'm a product of public schools in Westchester and Mount Vernon, one of the poorest cities in Westchester, admittedly 40 years ago. And I think the sense is that what are we trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to raise standards, or are we just trying to have some sort of standardization? And so I think some of these components, and it's listed under Common Core as the overall rubric, but there's a real desire to have the Board of Regents and the Commissioner of Education slow down. Let's evaluate what are we doing and what are we trying to accomplish. If we need to improve school districts that are impacted economically and in terms of results, let's focus our efforts on those districts. Let's not try to have a one-size-fits-all strategy that involves districts that are already achieving at a certain level and then having a test, which I have to tell you, we should give the test that the students just had. We should give that test to all 213 state legislators and see how we do. And I'll bet you, I'm not sure I'd pass it. I'm not sure many of my colleagues would without knowing what's on the test beforehand. Does that mean we're deficient as adults? And I think there's a real sense, certainly in the area that I represent, that this is being badly implemented and maybe badly thought out.
I mean, I agree with you to a certain degree. My daughter is a public school student. She's in kindergarten, and I was trying to help her with her homework, and the instructions and one of the math assignments I thought was absolutely obscure. And when we did the assignment, the teacher said that you had done it incorrectly. So, if an adult is having problems mastering a kindergarten homework, obviously there is some sort of problem there. But do you think that essentially the issue is testing, or is it the fact that these tests every year bring about an environment where teachers feel that they're beholden to teach to the test?
Well, I think that is a concern that we have, because in those communities where you have exceptional teachers, teaching to the test dumbs down what they're accomplishing. I can think of a teacher in the Mamaroneck School District who has programs that are off campus, that are outside, that give experiential, in a social studies environment, experiential classes where you go into the county legislature, or you go off to New Hampshire and you get involved over a weekend in a political campaign, so you can see what it is like. It brings it alive in the minds of the students. When you focus on mandatory testing and you must hit this mark in the test on a consistent basis, you take away that creativity. Now you start to say, listen, teach to the test, and not only are the students being judged by the test, but the teacher is being judged by the test. And I worried, are we testing because we want to test the students, or are we just doing this to test the teachers? Is that really what the metric is? I come out of a corporate background, so unlike many of my colleagues, I spent 20 years working for major U.S. corporations. We don't apply one size fits all to every situation. We try to deal with a business problem on its merits, its circumstances. And if there's one set of problems that affect a project in one state, we use one set of strategies and we differ those strategies in a different location. And I think that's what we're missing in the way we're rolling out the Common Core. It's almost standardization for standardization's benefit.
But when you're running a business, you have some very objective metrics. I mean, you have the bottom line. Do you think that these standards are being put in place because of, is it a political decision that we have to impose some sort of a quantifiable accountability upon it? Or do you think that this is really a well-intentioned attempt to get our students college ready?
Well, in most cases, there is a quantifiable and a qualitative evaluation that has to happen. And depending on what you do for a living, my very first job was in sales, extremely quantifiable. You book a certain amount of business, you have signed contracts, the effort you put in is qualitative, but it's really, did you close business, did you generate revenue? But when we're talking about a teacher and the skill set of a teacher in the classroom, there's no question that some of that is quantifiable. But if you go into a community that has schools that serve people who are economically poor, whether it's a rural district or an urban district, would you be shocked to find that those students don't perform as well as those in a more affluent district? How much of that do you attach to the teacher? To some degree. But isn't it more of a qualitative evaluation? And don't you, if you're an administrator, if you're a master teacher, don't you sit in the room and monitor how the teacher teaches and let that be a significant portion of how that teacher is evaluated? Because at the end of the day, there's been an argument in New York State, and that is that we spend more money on education and we don't get the results. I don't buy that. I think we failed to get the results in specific districts because of specific reasons. And in other districts, we more than have our successful results. Our graduates in certain school districts, and I certainly represent quite a few of them, and on Long Island there are quite a few of them, we graduate students every year that go on to successful careers at the Yales and the Harvards of the world, the two-year institutions as well. So I don't think that's a sign of the failure of New York education. I think you have to look at where are the problems and address those problems in those districts. And if in a particular district it's a testing metric that will give you a better sense of where the problems are, then do that. But let me say this much. We had, for example, this year, a cutback in the 21st century funding, which meant after-school programs were cut in Portchester, in White Plains, in New Rochelle, in Tarrytown, all Westchester County areas. There are other ones around the state. When those programs are cut, that's the kind of remedial effort you put in when you find deficiency. Your students aren't performing well. So you have pre-K services, you have after-school services to help them broaden their experiences, deal if they're not an English language speaker. So we can talk about testing all we want, but if we cut afternoon programs in Portchester and Tarrytown, we're cutting the very thing that would help solve the problem that we've identified with testing. So to me, it's a very illogical way to approach it. I really do think the Board of Regents, as committed as they are to this, as committed nationally as we are, it's a great slogan, race to the top. Well, I don't want somebody to win a race to the top. I want everybody to win the race to the top, not just somebody. And to do that, I think you have to look at everybody running, not just the guy who wins the race to the top.
But when you say that we should kind of slow down, I mean, haven't we been failing our students for arguably generations now? And if we are to say, okay, we're not ready to take these steps forward, and we need to reflect upon it more, that we will be shortchanging our students who are in the system right now?
The presumption, Morgan, is that the things that we're doing will solve that problem. That by playing with the curriculum, by restructuring the curriculum, things like read more nonfiction and less fiction. The real problem is, what do we do in those homes where the parents are not engaged in the education of their kids? If I saw the programs that we were advancing was to figure out how to more deeply engage parents in the education of their kids, then I'd say, great program, full speed ahead, because that's what will help correct the situation. The way you are with your kindergartner at home, the way my mother, who was a blue-collar worker, but how she read to me when I was a child. When that's not happening, that's what's contributing to the poor results. Some of it is money, but some of it is teaching strategies. That's what we're not focusing on when we have standardized testing as the cutting edge of what we're doing. And when I say slow down, I'm not saying, throw everything out, and I'm not saying this person should resign or that, but we're in such a rush to accept a set of concepts that are presented to us as if we change our curriculum, we will get better results. Maybe, but I'm not sure that's manifest. When my daughter was in elementary school, and she's now graduated and married and so forth, but when she was in elementary school in the mid-'80s, they had a strategy for teaching English called whole language. And it didn't emphasize spelling, and there was a host of different elements to it. It was hard for me to help her with her homework, not understanding how she was being taught. The bottom line is educators scrapped whole language after a few years. It was an innovation that ultimately didn't succeed. And that's what I'm afraid. If we're going to lose a generation of students, we're going to lose them right now. We're going to turn them off to school. Too much testing. Daddy, I'm scared. I have to go in and spend hours being tested as a fourth grader.
Right, we get too enamored with the flavor of the month.
Yeah, and so what I also think is really the focus that we ought to have is go back to the classroom experience and what works and what doesn't work. Let's not sit outside, sitting on Washington Avenue in the SED offices or sitting across the street in the Capitol and try to theorize what it is that we should be doing. Let's see on the ground in the classroom what works and what doesn't work, and depending on the students. And I think, and this is something you can do, challenge us as legislators to take the same test that we're asking our 10th graders to take. See how we do, and then make a judgment if these standard tests help you evaluate skills or not.
I think you've thrown down the gauntlet. I think that city and state will have to do that.
I may very well fail that test.
I hope I don't have to take the test.
Well,
you talked about parents' involvement, and I often think that isn't that one of the inherent problems from a political standpoint with our education system, is that a lot of that accountability does rest on the parents, right? If you sit down and you read with your child every night, your child will thrive in a way that they won't if you don't read to them. But you can't say to the voter, you know what, you're screwing up.
Well, what you see when you're in a smaller school district is a closer correlation between the principal, the administrators of a school, the teachers of a school, and the parents of the student in the school. And you cannot deny that there's a track in terms of wealth, poverty, and middle class status. The more the parents are out working to survive, the less able they are to come in and meet with the teacher and be part of that experience. But I've gone into some of the elementary schools and middle schools in my district where there was strong parental involvement, and you could see the connection between what the kids are doing when they're not in the school campus, and then where you have situations, for whatever the reasons are, and let's face it, there's social ills in some of our areas, both rural and urban as well as in suburban, where you don't have that parental connection, you don't get the same result. So to me, that should be a focus of what our attention is, because you're absolutely right. The role of the parent, ideally, every parent should be able to devote that time and effort. Not everyone can, but then the school has to see, are there strategies that would work in trying to help that happen? Harder to do, the bigger the district, the more diverse the student base is.
You talked about the hearings that Commissioner King was holding, and then there was this kind of lashing out at him, and then he canceled the hearings. Now Merrill Tisch has scheduled many more. Do you think that this was mishandled by the commissioner, and do you feel that he should be accountable for the way that this was conducted?
It's very simple. There are people who are angry out there, and in a non-aggressive voice I'm saying that. But I have seen that anger well below the level of public hearings by going into schools and having meetings in clusters within one particular school building or within one particular district. That anger is out there. However you structure your public input, the Senate Republicans hold a series of public hearings on this. Commissioner King now has restarted another set of hearings. The anger is out there, and it has to be understood and has to be dealt with. It can't be glossed over. It can't be dealt with as a PR problem. It is a substantive problem for people who spend a lot of tax money to have kids go to a school district in communities where they have made a significant investment, in great part because of the quality of the school districts. Now you do a set of tests, the tests come out, oh, New York students aren't as smart as they were a year ago. I don't quite know how you make that judgment. But within the context of what the commissioner needs to do and the Board of Regents do, they need to stop and they really need to listen. And they need to talk to the people on the ground to get a better idea of what's happening. And I think to do that, being out in the community is helpful, public hearings are helpful, but I think they also need to see the classroom experience as well. And I hope what that will do, will have them reconsider the path and direction they're going in.
When you talk about this reaction to Common Core, if you at least look at it from an institutional standpoint, you have the Board of Regents on board, you have the governor on board, you have the UFT on board. It seems like you have all the stakeholders are really in agreement that Common Core is the right direction to go. Is this just groupthink, or is there some real merit to the fact that there seems to be an accord in this approach?
About 30 years ago in business, Coca-Cola Corporation, which had one of the most successful brands in Coke, decided that they need to reformat Coke. This is a business reality. I did not work for the company. I worked for a competitive company. I understood what was happening at the time. It's now part of every B school, business school case study. They determined, the corporate leadership decided it was time to reformat Coke into a new Coke. And it turned out to be a disaster. But everybody signed on to it. All of the senior corporate executives, the people who were involved in the chemical side of the creation of the new formula, and they all believed this was going to be Coke for a new generation. They found out that the public didn't like it. And one thing that business does do, when the consumers aren't buying what you're selling, they step back and they take another look. So I would say no matter how many people of stature have signed on to the concepts, if the consumer, the parent, because the student is not necessarily able to make an ultimate judgment of how they're consuming the testing and the curriculum, if the parents are having problems with it, it's a reason to stop and to reevaluate. And if it turns out that you're going to have to say, you know what about new Coke? Didn't work, let's go back to old Coke, or let's modify it. I'm not saying there isn't room for reform and changes, there are. But let's make it based on what we see on the ground and not just necessarily from a 10,000-foot view where you're looking down and you're saying, well, we need to rearrange the curriculum, we need to do this and we need to do that, and that will help us put in a better situation. The metrics in some school districts are excellent. Those metrics are things that we point to as successes. Why we have to redefine that somehow after the fact as a failure is unknown to me. And it's upsetting to the people that are involved in it.
Shifting gears to some Westchester questions. This week, the S&P lowered the Tappan Z's bond rating from A+ to A. What are going to be the implications of that, and is that really a disaster for the area?
Well, I think it's too soon to tell. The Tappan Zee Bridge is an essential project. Governor Cuomo gets high marks across the board for prioritizing it and for showing leadership and pushing this through. We had spent easily 15 years talking about a bridge that had reached and passed its functional life. And obviously, if you don't deal with that issue at some point in time, you could have a disaster on your hands. And even if you don't have a disaster that involves human safety and health, to lose that as a connective between Rockland County and Westchester County is incalculable for the people who live and work on both sides of the bridge. So he rightfully pushed forward and through. There are commitments we need to have from the federal government that are not yet in place. There will ultimately be an assessment of what the toll costs are going to be and how much the individual users are going to pay on that bridge. And it's going to be higher than what it is now, which is a $5 toll. With those things not in place, I could understand where a rating agency would look and say, well, we don't exactly see how all the numbers are going to fit in the long run. But the governor, to his credit, has pushed forward. They have a design in place in record time, a design-build strategy, which for this particular project, this massive a public project as it is a necessary means of advancing the project. So my sense is that the short-term downgrade in the rating, I guess it's for the Thruway Authority bonds, because that's the entity, that's the parent entity, is not necessarily the final word. We have to put together, we have to put together all of the different elements, financing elements to this, and we're going to have to at some point in time have a firm commitment from the federal government. Good luck with that right now, given where the federal government is at. And we're going to have to plunk down at some point in time with where we are with the toll. And it's never going to be popular, because whatever price it is, it's higher than what it is today, and people will object to that. I commuted over that bridge 4 or 5 years of my corporate life at some point in time or another, and it's no fun to be in a long line. I had a reverse commute, so I came back at night waiting to pay a toll. But you need a new Tappan Zee Bridge that's going to be there long after I've left this planet. So I'm not concerned about it in the short term, but I do think it means we have to address the long-term financing of this. And I think the governor has shown already commitment to this issue, leadership on this issue. I expect that will be manifest in the next year.
You're the former chair of the Westchester Democratic Party, and
worst job I ever had, I must tell you. I've had other jobs in my public career. Very tough to be a political leader. It was not my cup of tea.
Well, the Democrats obviously have a significant registration advantage in Westchester, and yet you have a Republican as the Westchester County executive who seems to be leading significantly in the polls against Noam Bramson. How do you explain that disconnect?
Well, first of all, you have an incumbent who is a very charming guy. I served with him briefly in the Westchester County Legislature, and he is a good campaigner. I mean, he's out in public, and he wins people over as he meets them face to face. And so during his 4 years of incumbency, he's kept a very simple message about taxes, and he has hammered on that. And there's no question that the property tax problems of Westchester and the other suburban communities are always number one. Anytime you poll Long Island, Westchester, Rockland, Putnam, you're going to see property taxes as the number one issue, unlike what you would get out of the city and parts of upstate. So he has, as an individual, created a very positive message that he's brought into the race. I think what you've seen, and I don't have recent polling data, Morgan, so I'm giving you conventional wisdom. The gap was much larger earlier in the campaign, probably a double-digit gap. My understanding as we sit here today, we're still at this taping a little less than a week from the election. The margin is single digits. Probably, the county executive is still ahead of Democratic challenger Noam Bramson, but I sense that it's narrowing. And what you basically have now is Democrats who didn't know Noam Bramson, who are now, as they get close to the decision, learning who he is and deciding with an endorsement from the Journal News. We await the New York Times' editorial as we're sitting here today, which will be impactful in the race. Prominent people like Governor Cuomo, President Clinton coming out to endorse him, Senator Chuck Schumer. All of those things will help Democrats have a greater comfort. And then it'll come to Election Day, get out the vote, turnout will matter in a race like this because it is an odd-numbered year. It's not an automatic turnout, and folks don't always make the connection of how county government, or for that matter, municipal government affects their lives every day. They come out for the presidency, but they don't always come out in these races. I've run many times in this odd-numbered year cycle, and people will tell you the day after the election, oh, was there an election yesterday? I didn't even know. And so I think that's the challenge coming down the home stretch. It's going to be a close election. I think it could go either way, but I think Noam Bramson is going to be right there on, and I don't expect we'll even know on election night. I think it'll probably take a day or two to sort it out.
Looking ahead to the 2014 session, you are a former assemblyman, and the problems that Speaker Silver has had were a factor in your race with Bob Cohen in 2012. More recently, he's had these problems with some of his close associates, with Willie Rapfogel, and by extension, it seems like with Judy Rapfogel. How do you think this is going to impact Speaker Silver this session?
Well, I think the Speaker has proven over an extended period of time that he's got a solid base of support in the members of the Assembly. And there are issues that you can certainly point to as being difficult issues to deal with. Some of them are on these kinds of issues. The case of Vito Lopez is just a sad and unfortunate case. I said at the time he should have resigned months before he did resign, and he shouldn't have looked for any kind of settlement. He should have fessed up to what his misdeeds were and done it that way. And the Speaker himself said he made bad decisions in that particular case. What happens in some of these other cases are hard to know as they play out. But I don't think, if the question is the Speaker's jeopardy of staying Speaker, I don't think he's in jeopardy during the course of this cycle. But I do think that this year's electoral process is going to be a tough one. Many of my colleagues will be running races where the Republicans will try to make the election just a referendum on whether the Speaker should stay in or not. And I think each of the members who run, myself included, we have to run on the merits of what we've done. I can point to support from other people, but I've got to be able to say why it is I've made a strong case. And I think that's what most of my former colleagues in the Assembly, and still my friends, are going to do. They're going to say, look, you can judge the Speaker and you can judge other individuals for what they've done, but you're going to have to judge me based on what I've done. And that, I think, will drive the politics of 2014. In terms of the session, there's some heavy-duty debates ahead of us. The governor's talking about tax cuts as part of this budget. How will that be structured and financed in the budget? We're looking at trying to deal with the women's equality agenda, and strategically, do you do 9 bullets but not 10? In all of those things, the Speaker's knowledge and his experience is going to be, I think, a very critical part of how the Assembly deals with these issues. Me, I'm in the other house, and I have to work in a different environment and learn a different environment of players and personnel. For whatever my experience is, I'm a freshman in the house I'm in now. And so my job is cut out for me.
Despite being a freshman, you passed 4 bills through both houses last year, only one of which was vetoed by the governor. What is your top legislative priority this year? Is there a bill that you're really trying to carry to fruition?
Well, I think whenever you represent a suburban or an upstate district, your bills fall into 2 categories: local bills, local option bills, which generally get a better hearing whether you're in the majority or the minority, and then some of the more broad-based issues, which are hard for any minority member of the Assembly or the Senate to pass. And being in the minority, although perhaps there are more Democrats and Republicans in the chamber, but we in the mainstream Democratic conference right now do not have a majority of the votes to pass our bills. It's a tough slug. We talked earlier before about property taxes in the suburbs, and I think that remains the #1 suburban issue. there are some bills out there that would involve mandate relief that I think are essential. And whether I'm the prime sponsor of the bill or co-sponsor of the bill, movement in that direction would be important for us to try to gain. I mean, there are bills that would start to phase out the state mandate for county governments to pay for Medicaid costs. There have been some capping of it, but a phase out of the base cost. That represents a huge hit on our local property taxes where we pay the county portion of it. We still have local governments, cities, towns, villages, and the county government paying the MTA payroll tax. We've relieved that from small businesses, we've relieved that from school districts, but we still have local governments paying for it. In the city of Yonkers, that's a $700,000 cost factor in the city of Yonkers budgets. And keep in mind the tax cap is now targeted because of the inflationary rate at 1.66, not 2%, 1.66. That's going to put our municipal officials and our school districts in a very tight spot to stay within the tax cap. Overriding the tax cap is hard to envision in most of these places for many reasons. So I think any mandate relief, anything we can do to share more fairly the pension burden, to keep the pension fund whole, but at the same time not drop that mandated cost on some of the local governments would be helpful. And I look first to see the governor's budget, to see how he processes these things, because a lot of policy gets dealt with in the governor's budget before we even get to standalone legislation. So as you very well know, the first half of the football game, halftime, and then the second half of the football game, the first half of the game is the budget. And I think that's what we'll focus on. And then we'll see what individual pieces of legislation may or may not move thereafter.
Senator Latimer, thank you so much for joining us.
Morgan, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
And that's it for this episode of Last Look. For more episodes, please join us on the web at cityandstateny.com.